Morning, Ken. Sound?
Oh, there you are.
Oh, great. Perfect.
Yep.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us early.
No problem.
How are things? How's the vineyard?
Oh, it's starting to grow now. It took a while there for things were cool, of course, but
Yeah,
she's supposed to be warming up pretty good this week here now.
looks like it. Yeah, I put in one himrod grape just because I wanted something in the garden and it took forever to get going.
Yeah.
But everything's finally waking up, like the rootstock's waking up now too, and things are looking good.
Yeah. So the cherry crop you were saying here in the valley is pretty bad.
Unfortunately, yeah, it's pretty rough. I think we probably had quite a bit of damage in that January time when we dropped significantly in temperatures, and yeah, it just seems that unfortunately it's pretty much in the top third of the canopy and not much on the bottom. So
Huh.
yeah.
I didn't
So
know if it was something to do. Like I thought the weather when they were flowering appeared to be not too bad, but
yeah, that part wasn't too bad. I mean, we had a couple little frost days, but not.
I think I've lost you.
Some blocks just not flowering at all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, oh, there we go. We've got a few more joining. Good morning, everyone.
Yep.
Morning, Dwayne. Oh, no sound. Oh, you're muted.
You're still on mute.
Perfect. Okay, great.
Good morning.
Okay, well, this might be it. So we could probably get going. Great. All right, so good morning, everyone. I did hit record this morning. Dwayne kindly reminded me early on. So Ken, just to let you know that we're going to try to record the meetings and then send them out to our mailing list
Yep.
of growers in Creston. And so we will get started this morning's meeting. We invited Ken Sapsford from the Ministry of Agriculture. Ken's a pesticide specialist with the ministry, but also I think is really a weed scientist at heart and certainly has a lot of information to share about herbicide calibrations and the application of herbicides in orchards. And Ken also grows his own vineyard, so has some practical horticultural knowledge of his own that he, I'm sure, will draw from. So we're excited to have Ken with us this morning. And we thought for program this morning, we'd start with your presentation, Ken, to allow for the presentation and some questions from the growers. And you can type in questions in the chat again, or I can unmute people if we want to have more discussion after Ken's presentation. And then Dwayne and I've just got a couple horticultural updates for this week on timings for cherries as well as products. So I think we will get going, and certainly type into the chat if there's any issues or questions along the way. So Ken, I'll turn it over to you to share your screen.
Okay. Okay, can you see the opening slide there?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let's take and see what's going on here. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
All right, that might be me.
Yeah.
Hold on here. Okay, who can share? Let's try this again. Okay, try that then, Ken.
Yep, that looks better.
Awesome. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay, can you see the opening slide now?
Yeah, that's looking good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks, Molly. And yeah, like she said, we'll take and try to answer any questions you have. Either type them in, or at the end we can do some discussions on this. So my background is, like Molly said, I've come from field crop research in weed control in Saskatchewan with the University of Saskatchewan. And when I came out here and started to see what was happening with, just either the use of glyphosate or of gramoxone as kind of the only weed control options that a lot of growers were using when I first came out here, I thought, yeah, they just haven't had you haven't had a weed scientist with the Ministry of Agriculture, and the same with Ag Canada, so that a lot of the the new information just wasn't getting disseminated to the growers. So hopefully you'll find some new information in here and make you think a little bit about how you do your operation. So when we're talking herbicides, the first thing we need to know how they work. And understanding the different ways a herbicide affect plants gives you the opportunity of when is the best time to apply and how to control that pest. Not all pesticides kill plants in the same fashion. There is 27 different what's called modes of action. We know a lot of growers out here, they know about the fungicides, they've got to rotate groups. Well, the same things with herbicides. And there are 27 different modes of action, which sounds like we have a lot. However, only 16 of these modes of action are registered in Canada. There's only 13 that are registered on tree fruit. And actually it's only 12 because one of those groups registered is paraquat, which is gramoxone, which is no longer available. But then we get down to how many do most growers actually use? Is it one group, two groups, maybe four at the most? So we've got to look at when these products were originally registered, and this is a timeline here that shows that the first herbicides were registered back in the 30s. And you'll notice in the this group number 4, which came in the early 40s. That's the 2,4-Ds and MCPAs, and that's when they were first discovered. And this is all the 26 and when they were discovered. And you'll notice the last group that we use, the very last one, that group 26 up there at the top, is not registered in Canada. So the last one group that was registered in Canada that was discovered was 1983. We have had no new herbicide groupings discovered since 1983. There has been a few compounds, but they're all the same. They still work the same. So there's nothing new in herbicides coming down the pipeline. So whatever we have, we've got to make sure we don't get resistance to that group of herbicides. Do we have it in British Columbia? Well, in 2019, this was the first time that a herbicide resistance survey was done in British Columbia. There was 3 fields that were selected in the Abbotsford region. And in those 3 fields, they found 2 weeds that had resistance. Canada fleabane was resistant to group 5s and group 7s, and red root pigweed was resistant to group 5. And this is just by checking 3 fields in the lower mainland. To kind of get a picture of what we may have here in British Columbia, in Washington Strait, there's 13 herbicide-resistant weed populations that have been identified. And they have found resistance to group 2s, group 5s, group 7s, and group 15s in Washington State. So the border doesn't stop the weeds from moving across, and our practices have been very similar to theirs. So I would suspect that we do have some herbicide-resistant weeds here as well. Just we haven't looked. So when we're looking at herbicides, how do we improve the efficacy of that product to make sure it's working for us? If we're looking at a soil residual product, we've got to look at, usually requires rainfall or incorporation to move it into the soil, because a soil residual product usually is working on the germinating seedlings or on the roots of the young plants as they start to grow. So it needs to be down into the soil, not sitting on the surface. And it needs to contact the soil to be effective. And there's some differences here where some of the products do state right on label that any heavy residue and any other materials will affect the efficacy of the product. It's tied up in that organic matter on the surface. So some products really need to have a bare soil that they're applied to. The foliar applied herbicides, they work best. Usually if the plants are clean and free of dust. They need to be actively growing. And that's one of the key things, is if you take and apply a pesticide to a weed that is under drought conditions, then all the stomata are closed and the pesticide does not enter that plant very well. And usually annual plants need to be small. The smaller the plant, the easier it is to control. The one exception to this is glyphosate, because glyphosate will kill larger plants because it translocates down through the root system. So it does take in the product through the leaves, moves it down to the roots and kills the root of the plant, and then the top part dies off. So it's one exception to that small plant. Through the research, what we've looked at is that, for example, if you're using herbicide A or B, and either one of the herbicides, but you use that same herbicide year over year, then what you end up with is you're able to use it and it's working quite well for you for a number of applications. And then finally it starts to take, and some weeds start to show resistance, and it can develop resistance to that herbicide. If you were to take and use herbicide A one year and herbicide B the next year and rotate back and forth every year, what you do is you double the lifespan of both those herbicides and so before they develop resistance. But we also found that if you tank mix A and B together and you use both A and B herbicide both every year, that the chances of a weed developing resistance to those is extended even further out and more applications. So we can extend the life of these herbicides. However, in order for a herbicide mix to be effective in delaying resistance, it must control a similar species of weed and have a different mode of action. The other thing is that I would state on here is that you must use the recommended rate, the full rate of each of those products, because if you take and cut the rate in half, just because you're using the two herbicides, now you have two sublethal doses, and it may help develop resistance further. So you still need to use the full recommended rate, but put them both in there, and we end up with a better control. We know that those herbicides are going to last longer for us. When we look at the number of herbicides, like I mentioned, we have a number of modes of action. And when you look at the list, it looks like there's a good number of herbicides that are registered. I've got here the trade names, the active ingredient, the different groups they're in, whether they're what are the tree crops that they're registered on. And it looks like we have a good selection to choose from. However, like I mentioned, we're not using that full selection, and there's reason for it as well. And I'll kind of get into those here. If I'm looking at putting an orchard weed control package together, the first application in the spring, I look at, okay, I want a non-selective weed control, something that's going to control everything that we have out there pretty well. It's not selective. And there's two main choices. We have glyphosate, which is a group 9, and ignite, which is a group 10. Both of these have some pros and cons. And so glyphosate, the nice thing, it controls annual weeds, annual broadleaf and grassy weeds. It also controls perennial weeds. There is no known resistance in British Columbia. The cons of this product that I see are there's 43 resistant weeds worldwide to glyphosate. There's 6 resistant weed species in Canada. These are, some of them are on the prairies, some are in Ontario. And suckers need to be removed before you take and apply glyphosate to avoid damaging to the tree. Ignite, the pros of Ignite. It controls both annual broadleaf and grassy weeds. It does suppress field horsetail top growth only. The suckers are controlled. It has no known resistance in Canada. Some of the cons, there are 4 weed species that are resistant in the world to Ignite, but far less than glyphosate. However, it does not control perennials, and it states right on the label, apply to weeds less than 12 inches or 30 centimeters tall. So the larger weeds are tougher control with Ignite. Now, when I look at a spring application, and this is where I talked about tank mixes, what I would like to do is take one of those, either the glyphosate or the Ignite as my main herbicide. Now I'm going to add a tank mix partner. And what I'm looking for is a product that is a soil residual product from a different mode of action. Now it's easy to get the different mode of action because glyphosate's a group 9, Ignite's a group 10, and those are the only herbicides that are in those groups. So any other soil residual product that we choose is going to be from a different mode of action. I want it to provide control of the germinating weeds for 4 to 6 weeks into the summer. And so what are our options? So if I look at the group 2s, we have 2 group 2s. We have Sandia and now Prism. Okay, Sandia, the pros, group 2s have not been used in orchards in the past. That's one of the things that in the prairies and with field agriculture, we've had the group 2s since the 1980s, and they've been used a lot. They're a very good product and they work very well. That's where they were used extensively, but they develop resistance very quickly as well because they're a single site on the plant that they are attacking. And so there's a lot of group 2 resistance on the prairies, but because we have not had them registered in the orchards, we haven't used them. So we can use these products with using good management, and they will stick around for us, and they're a good weed control option. There's many broadleaf weeds on the Sandia label. It controls the weeds throughout part of the summer. I have seen some weeds controlled all the way through till August. Has suppression of field horsetail on the label. I haven't seen what it does to field horsetail. I'm just reading the label on here. Some of the cons, there's no grassy weed control with Sandia. So, and it is only registered on bearing apples at this time. Prism is the other one. Prism, group, again, a group 2 that have not been used in orchards in the past. It has many broadleaf weeds and annual grasses, some annual grasses on the label. It does control quackgrass. It's one of the perennial grasses that it states it will control. And it controls weeds throughout part of the summer. But it is only registered on stone fruit at this time. So depending on what you're growing, this becomes a choice that you've got to make. For group 3s, we have Prowl H2O. Group 3s have not been used much in orchards in the past, and it controls weed throughout part of the summer. However, one of the cons of the Prowl H2O, it has very few weeds on label, so it may not control all the weed species that you have growing in your orchard. The group 5s, this is like thin bar, Simazine, Princep 9T. They control weeds through the summer again, both grassy and broadleaf weeds. There's a good selection of weeds on label. However, this is the one we've got to watch for resistance because it's older chemistry. There's a large number of known resistant weeds in Canada to group 5s. There is, like I said, we have seen some, in the one study last year that they identified that there was group 5 resistance in the lower mainland. And so it's a product that if you have used this in the past, I would be cautious about using it again and definitely use it only not every time, just because it does have a lot of known resistance and we have been using it in the past because it was one of our only options. We have some group 14s, and again, these are fairly new over the last, I'd say 10 years. We've had Chateau. It's a broadleaf plus green foxtail. It's the only grassy weed on label. Some resistance control, and it's registered on all tree fruit. The other group 14 is Authority. It has broadleaf weeds plus crabgrass on label. Again, good resistance control. One of the cons of Authority is it's only registered on apples. The group 15, Dual Magnum. Again, the pros, annual grassy weed control, registered on all tree fruit. One of the cons is the only broadleaf weeds that are on the label are redroot pigweed and nightshade. So there's not very many, just the 2 broadleaf weeds on this label. So there's a limited weed spectrum. The group 29 is Allion. Pros, many broadleaf weeds and grasses weeds controlled. It's registered on all tree fruit, and it has long-term residual control. One of the cons is that, and it states right on the label, and this is one of the ones, that ground heavily covered with leaves or trash may adversely affect weed control. And I have seen Allion applied to an area where there was a heavy trash layer, and the year of application, there was almost no residual control with the product. However, the second year, because as that trash broke down and moved into the soil, the allion went into the soil then, and we had better weed control in the second year than we did the first. So the trash cover on this product is very important. If it's heavy trash, it will not get into the soil. I also put long-term residual control as a con on this, is because it's something you need to manage, because it will take and control weeds more than 1 year. And also you need to look at what effect it will have on young plants if you're trying to do any replanting in there at all. I do not recommend you use a product like Allion 2 years in a row. Because of the residual, you can get it to build up in the soil. So if you take and use that as your first application, the Ignite or the glyphosate mixed with one of those soil residual products, then when you do have some weeds regrowing in the midsummer, I look at, okay, what are your options for your second application? What I state is, do not repeat a residual weed control product. And again, the reason for this is because if you take and have a residual control product in there and you put it down for a second time, you now have that sitting there, and any weeds that break through that are going to be resistant to that if they're normally controlled. And so we don't want to overload the system in any 1 year. Non-selective options again, in this one, I have Ignite and Aim. I could put glyphosate in here, and I know growers do not like to use glyphosate at this time because of the sucker problem, and so we're not even considering glyphosate at this application. One thing I have seen is Ignite will do a good weed control, but it is poor on sucker control, where Aim is the other way around. Good sucker control, poor on weed control larger than 4-leaf. The other options you have, and I know a lot of these are not used much, but they are registered. Some of the group ones, we have Post Ultra, Venture, Select, and Centurion. The group 1 herbicides are annual grass control only, and that's the main problem with them. They're also, these products were registered for the cereal crops, for the canolas, etc., on the prairies, where the application timing is the 2 to 6 leaf stage. Once we get up into those larger plants that are 8, 10 leaves that are starting to head out, these products do not work that well. They work much better on the smaller plants. The group 4s, 2,4-D and Lontrell are both registered, 2,4-D. It has not been used a lot because of one of the big things is the drift. You do not want to have it drifting up into the tree at all. The Lontrell, it is only registered for spot treatment of vetch in apples. And there was a notice came out from Corteva, who manufactures Lontrell. It will no longer be manufacturing and selling Lontrell after 2020. So they're getting rid of their stock this year. And so I have not heard if any generic company will be supplying it and putting apples on label, but Lontrell may be leaving us after this year. Basagran, it's a group 6, the only group 6 we have registered. And so it's registered on newly planted fruit trees. And again, the big one listed at the bottom there is most weeds should be less than 6 inches tall in order for Basagran to effectively control them. Group 14, the group 14 what we have now is AIM. And what we have found is that AIM is, like I said, is good sucker control, but it states right on label, apply when weeds are less than 7.5 centimeters or 3 inches tall. Poor weed control on larger weeds. So those are our choices. You notice there's a lot that have on label, but they're, I have a few issues and cons on them. So personally, if I'm putting together a package for an orchard, what do I look at? What I would like is I would use this glyphosate in the spring. I would tank mix this with one of the following. I would use either Allion or Chateau or Sandia in apples or Prism in stone fruit. That gives me the group 9 and then either a group 29, 14, or 2. And those, the 29, 14, and 2 is my residual control that will take and control weeds through into part of the summer to help keep it clean, so I maybe have less applications through the year. For my second application, I would use either Ignite and or AIM. Now I've got an and or in here. I just didn't say or AIM. Because what we've seen is Ignite is a much better weed control option and AIM is a better sucker control option. If we were to tank mix those two together and apply them, we would get good weed control and good sucker control with that application. I'm not looking at costs here. I know some growers have said, well, that becomes a very expensive option. It's a matter of whether it's going to work for you. If it does the job, sometimes that extra dollars is worth it to get it done properly. So personally, that's kind of where I look. You notice that we had those 13 different groups. Well, with this, I do give you the option here of about 5 different groups and 6 different groups. And those are the main ones that we need to use, but at least we're using them now so that in each year, we have at least 3 modes of action going down each year. And I would take and rotate the Allion, the Chateau, Sandia, or Prism from one year to the next that I'm mixing with my glyphosate. So that takes and gives me a mixture from a different option from year 1 to year 2 to give me more modes of action through there. The other time is late fall weed control. And the one option there is the casseron. It needs to be applied after the trees are dormant when temperatures are below 15 degrees. It is the one product that I have seen that will control field horsetail for 1 to 2 years. You may need to reapply in areas that you have field horsetail. One of the real problems with casseron is that the granular application. It's a granular product, so it requires that special equipment that not many growers have, or else you're applying it by hand, which is with a little lawn hand sprinter. And you really need to watch where these granules spread, because in your pathway where you want to have your grass or stuff growing, this will control all weeds, not just what you're trying to identify. So it will take and affect any of the planted stuff that you have, the grass in your pathway. So you have to be careful where it is getting spread to as well. The other one I didn't mention here is glyphosate. Glyphosate can be used as a fall application for perennial weed control, and it will work. You really need to watch with the fall application of glyphosate to make sure that the green bark and the suckers are not active, because that will take and move the glyphosate into the root system of the trees. The injury will show up next year when they start to grow again, because it is stored in the roots. And the roots, the fall application with glyphosate is one that is very effective at controlling perennial weeds, because it is moving all of the energy and the nutrients from the plant into the root system to store for the winter, and it takes the glyphosate down. The same thing happens to the trees. If you are applying it, it will take and move into the root system of the tree as well. So when I look at resistance management, I look at using IPM. That includes maybe non-chemical weed control, integrated pest management. Use multiple modes of action that are available to you. Use the proper rate. Do not cut rates on any products that you're applying. Monitor weeds after application. And this is where I say, if there's a product that is supposed to kill a specific species of weed, and you go out there and you find a patch of it, it's not likely that your sprayer missed that one patch. That could be a resistance patch. If you do find any of those resistant patches or weeds that are popping up that you thought should have been killed, just do not allow the seeds to shed back onto the soil, because all the seeds of those resistant plants are now also going to grow up as a resistant plant. So if you see any escapes, cut them off before they take and set seed so that you can avoid the seed set. Excuse me. There is an excellent website, and this is not just for weed resistance management. This is for insects, disease, weed control, resistance, and it's a good set of series of videos that they have set up, and the videos can all be found at www.manageresistancenow.ca. And they're a good set of videos to go through to help remind you what needs to be done to avoid resistance with all of these. So it's a good thing to check out. So now we kind of decided what we're going to spray. And now before we ever start spraying, we've got to look at calibrating. Because it doesn't matter what herbicides you apply if you have not calibrated your sprayer. And this is the one thing that needs to be done to ensure that we're getting the proper rate of the proper product to the location where we want it to be going. All herbicides should also be applied at a per acre rate or per hectare rate to applied area. And I say this to applied area because we're not spraying. If you've got a 5-acre orchard, your weed control is not going on 5 acres. You're only probably spraying, depending on the structure of your plants and whatnot, 40 to 50, 60% of that area. And that's the applied area, not the total area. And that's what we've got to make sure. And not use this percent solution. I use a 1% or a 2%, because that does not tell me anything, because it depends a lot on the travel speed and the nozzles you have in there, what you're putting down. And especially when we get to these soil residual products, this is where, when you start doing some tank mixes with those, you have to make sure that you're applying at the correct rate. Because if you do over apply, you could end up with some long-term residual that you're not expecting and have some troubles with certain issues. And so the rate becomes very important as well. And let's look at the per hectare per acre rate and make sure we're applying it correctly. So for calibrating a herbicide sprayer, there's just a few things we must know. We need to know the tractor speed, either in kilometers per hour or miles per hour. The delivery rate, and when I talk delivery rate, this is the rate that's coming out of the nozzles, and so that you know how many liters per hectare or gallons per acre that you are putting down onto the ground of the pesticide mixture that's in your tank. And we need to know the distance between our nozzles when we're calibrating, or if you're using just a single nozzle, we need to know the width of that spray that is hitting the ground with that one nozzle. Again, centimeters or inches. What units do you use? Personally, I like the metric. And the reason that I like using the metric system is because all of our labels, it lists the rate to apply in liters per hectare or grams per hectare. So if we calibrate everything out using the metric system, then if you wanted to take and look at gallons per acre that you're applying, we can do one conversion at the end. A few quick conversions here that are useful. One of the things that even by using the metric system, the metrics are always talking, when we look at pressure, it's listed in bars. Most of the sprayers that I see out here and all over, our pressure gauges are in pounds per square inch. So a quick rule is that 1 bar is approximately 15 pounds per 15 PSI. So it's pretty easy to look at 2 bars is 30 psi, you know, the kilometer, 1 liter. And the other thing to remember that it is always US gallons. All of the charts and everything that we have on our nozzles, when they're talking about the rate flow through the nozzle in gallons, it's US gallons that they're speaking. Like I said, if we work through the metric system, we can take and quickly convert, because 1 liter per acre, and this is where we get kind of confused between the metric and the US gallon system and the acres, because quite often we'll have a sprayer tank that is in liters, but we think of our orchard in acres. So we're mixing the two of them up. If you're looking at 1 liter per acre, I think I've got something wrong there. Yes, I do. 1 liter per hectare would be 2.5. Nope. You see, and this is the reason that yes, no, it is correct. 1 liter per acre is 2.5 liters per hectare. 1 gallon per acre is approximately 10 liters per hectare. Gallon per acre is 10 liters per hectare. That's the problem when it comes to when you start converting back and forth between the systems. If you are doing it, you could take and sometimes get those flipped up because you get them twisted in your head and it just doesn't work and you end up with the wrong rate. So that's why I like to stick with 1 rate through the entire system. And I'll show you that. So the order of calibration. We need to know our tractor speed, and we need to know a desired delivery rate. And this is the rate that you want to put out. If it's 200, 300 liters per hectare, then that's what we need to know in order to select the proper nozzles and the travel speed. We need to know our nozzle spacing. We entered into one formula, and I'll show you this formula in a minute, to get the output per nozzle that we require in liters per minute. And then we just go to a chart from the nozzle manufacturers, whether it's T-Jet or Allbuzz. And the final thing is we check the nozzle output with using a measuring cup, or I'll show you a spot-on spray calibrating that I use. Now, a lot of times when someone says check the speed of your tractor, they talk about measuring off a distance and timing it and going 2 or 3 times with your sprayer half full. Well, let's move into the technology. There are some apps out there, a couple I found, Speed Tractor and GPS, KPM. These will take and give you the speed that you're traveling. And what I use as well is I've got an old Garmin and an old satellite navigation system that before we all had smartphones. And it has a speed indicator on it. It has a suction cup to mount on the tractor. And I personally have a 1965 tractor here that obviously does not have a speedometer on it. And this is what I've used to take and check the numbers to make sure my speed is correct, and it is very good. It also, if you have a newer tractor, it's one way of checking to make sure the speedometer that you have on the tractor is accurate and working properly. Once you know the speed you're traveling, then we need to know what our desired delivery rate is and our nozzle spacing. And now I'm using just the metric system. So my speed is in kilometers per hour. My delivery rate is in liters per hectare, and this is of the applied area, and my nozzle spacing in centimeters. So the one formula is the output per nozzle in liters per minute. To determine what that is, we look at our target delivery rate times our travel speed times our nozzle spacing, and you divide that by a constant of 60,000. And people say, where does the constant come from? Well, it comes from because we have a whole bunch of different we've got liters per hectare, kilometers per hour, and meters, and we want to convert all that into liters per minute. And so that's what that constant does. It takes all those different numbers and it converts it into the appropriate area. So it's a constant that's used all the time. This is the constant for the metric system. There's a different constant if you were using the US gallons. But like I said, I'm just going to use the metric. So I'm going to use a target delivery rate here of 200 liters per hectare of applied area. 200 liters per hectare is sufficient delivery rate for all of the herbicides that we have. We do not like, and this is where some of my prairie background comes in. On the prairies, when they're spraying, they're using the delivery rate here of 50 liters per hectare. Because they're spraying huge acres, they do not want to spray high water volumes if they can avoid it, and they get excellent coverage on the plants, excellent weed control with that low rate. We do not need to see the water running off the weeds. That is not required with any herbicide. Even the Ignite that and the Gramoxone that we used to have, 200 liters per hectare is sufficient to cover everything. We could go lower. A lot of growers do not like to go lower than that because the, we get into a smaller nozzle that has chances more apt to plug or screens plug, etc. So 200 liters per hectare is a good water volume that you're able to cover the acres you need. For this example, I've just picked a travel speed of 5 kilometers per hour, which is 3 miles an hour. And this would change if you're driving at a different speed. If you're doing 8 kilometers an hour, we plug that number in. Nozzle spacing. The standard nozzle spacing is 50 centimeters between nozzles. That is 20 inches. And so that is the standard spacing. If your sprayer has a different spacing in there, that's going to change your delivery rate. So that's where you need to change and put in whatever that sprayer happens to be, divided by the constant. So when we put these parameters in here, we're looking for 200 liters per hectare at a travel speed of 5 kilometers an hour with our 50. What that should it be? It's in meters, so that should be 0.5. So it's a 50 centimeters. So I missed my decimal there. That's 0.5 meters. When we punch that in, that's supposed to be 50 centimeters. It's not supposed to be meters, that's centimeters. I noticed another error in my setting up my slide here. So that's 50 centimeters. So the output per nozzle is 0.83 liters per minute. So now we need to take and find a nozzle that is going to give us 0.83 liters per minute. This is where I go to the books. I can find these online, or you can have hard copies, usually from the dealer that you purchase your nozzles from, whether you're using the All-Buzz or T-Jet or other makes. The catalogs are all very similar. You will also notice that if you use the color-coded nozzles instead of the brass nozzles that we have, every company's, the orange ones will be the 01 nozzle, the green is the 015, the yellow is the 02, the purple is the 025, 03s are blue. So this is something that you can look very easily at your sprayer and know exactly what nozzles you have in there. And that's the same. So it doesn't matter whether you're buying an All-Buzz or a T-Jet nozzle. If I see a blue nozzle, I know it's an 03. That's a standard that has been set up. Also, it doesn't matter if this is a flat fan or an air induction nozzle, because all of these nozzles are producing the same amount of output. It's just the different nozzle for different droplet sizes, etc., that can occur. When I look at my 0.83 that I came out from my formula that I needed, I see that I can take and use 3 different nozzles here. And so I can use my O2 nozzle at around 3 to 4 bars pressure, probably about 3.5 bars or 3.1/3 bars will give me that 0.83 because it's in between those two. And the 3 bars is equivalent to 45 psi. I can go to an 025 nozzle at 2 bars, which is giving me the 0.81, which is 2 bars is 30 psi. Or I can go to an 03 nozzle at a 1.5 bar, and so the 1.5 bar is about 22 psi. And so there's 3 different nozzle selection sizes that I can choose. I could also go one down, one more, and I didn't circle it here, but the 015 nozzle at 6 bars. This gets to be pretty high because we're 90 psi there for a herbicide sprayer. That's getting too high as far as I'm concerned. We need to be a little bit lower than that, so I didn't even bother looking at that nozzle. So this is our nozzle selection that we're looking at for that rate that we wanted to have. Now when I look at the nozzle type, so you notice on my left here is my different nozzles, the bars pressure, and the first one here is a flat fan nozzle, and the second one that I have listed here is my Air Induction XR. It's an extended range. So AIXR is the air induction. And what this chart shows is the different droplet sizes. And so when I look at those 3 nozzles that I had at the pressure range that we were talking about from the charts, you'll notice that the flat fan nozzle, which has been the traditional nozzle that we have used, is a fine spray. The fine spray is almost always there. We do get into some mediums into these top end nozzles, but most of it is fine. This fine spray is what is very driftable and actually causes some of the drift problems either up into the tree or into the across fields and into other areas where we don't want it. If you look at the AIXR, which is the air induction with the extended range, we are now into the coarse to medium-sized droplets, into very coarse droplets here, the VC, or into the extra coarse as we get up into the larger nozzles. This is what I like to see. I like to see that coarse to medium droplet size. Even very coarse is all right for most applications, but I like the coarse to medium-sized droplets. These are not driftable. They take and go down. The air induction also has an extra advantage because the air induction nozzle has that air bubble inside it that is surrounded by the pesticide droplet. And as they hit the target, that air bubble works as a shock absorber so they don't bounce off, and they break apart and disperse into fine droplets covering your target. This one here is another air induction. This is the standard air induction with not the XR. And you will notice that the droplet size of that air induction is much larger. There's extra coarse at that same pressure range here at the O2 nozzle. We're looking at ultra coarse, which is a very large droplet. And even this one on the O3 gets at that pressure. They don't even list it because it is too large a droplet. And so that nozzle, it does produce very coarse droplets, which are not driftable, but quite often growers see this coming out. They don't think they're getting good coverage. And with certain products, if the weeds are small, I agree. So that's where I do like the other one, the AIXR, or the All Buzz nozzles are very similar to the AIXR and T-Jet. The other thing you'll find in your catalog is they take and help you to avoid having to go through all of the formulas that I just went through earlier, because if we look at this 5 kilometers an hour, I need to get the zoom, the 5 kilometers an hour, it tells us right here that we're putting on 190, 218 liters per hectare. Our target was 200 liters per hectare. Same here, 194 with the 025 nozzle, 199. So they've done the charts if you're using a standard speed that they have listed in there, and you don't even need to go through the formula, but it's just the one formula that I showed, pretty straightforward. Once you've selected the nozzle and your pressure range, then what you need to do is confirm it. Just because the nozzle states that it's supposed to be putting out 0.83, quite often I find that I do not get the flow rate that the nozzle manufacturers said. For whatever reason, they're a little bit lower, and so by checking it, I know exactly what it is, and therefore I can adjust my pressure or speed to make sure that I get the output that I'm looking for. So you can either confirm the delivery rate with using a stopwatch and a graduated cylinder or measuring cup. Excuse me. Or what I've started using, and I find these very handy, it's called the spot-on spray calibrator. The small one is used for herbicide sprayers, and the larger one I use for an air blast sprayer where I'm putting in higher volumes like 600 to 1,000 liters per hectare instead of the 200 liters per hectare. What these have is at the bottom, there's a single point. And so once you start to spray, you stick this underneath the nozzle as it is spraying. The liquid will hit the bottom point, and it's been turned on. I'm just going to back up. Just got it has a start button here. You turn that on, and this can either measure in liters per minute or gallons per minute or ounces per minute. You set it up ahead of time. Of course, I've got mine set at liters per minute. Hit the start button. You put it under the nozzle. And once the water hits this bottom pin, it says, okay, we're gonna start to fill up. It'll hit this pin just above that. Once it hits that pin, it starts counting. There's another pin right here, and that pin, once it hits that pin, it stops counting and it gives you a reading. I apologize, this is a little bit blurry, but this one, after I did it, it says 0.87. liters per minute. So instantly, I don't need to do any calibrations on with a stopwatch or whatever. It tells me that nozzle is putting out 0.87 liters per minute. And I'm able to take and check that with what I have on my formula, whether it's correct. The only place in Canada that I have found these is on the website through farmtronics.com, and they can be ordered. That's where I've ordered them. The small one is around $150 to $170. The large one is around $270, I believe. But they are one thing that is make calibration so much easier for both herbicide and air blast sprayers. So when you confirm the delivery rate of your nozzles, all nozzles should be within 5% of the average. You notice I said 5% of the average, not 5% of what the manufactured specifications are. Because if they're all within 5% of each other, you can adjust your pressure accordingly to make sure that you're getting, so that you get the average output that you want. If anything is more than 10 to 15% away from the manufacturers, then I would say replace it completely. The other thing is, of course, if you have a low delivery rate, check all the screens that are not, so make sure they're not plugged. Check the pressure is where it should be, and replace nozzles as required. We do not have a lot of nozzles on there. We're putting thousands of dollars worth of pesticide through those nozzles, so let's get the best nozzle. And that is why I like to see the color-coded that have a stainless steel or a ceramic insert instead of the brass, because the brass wears out very quickly. The other nozzles will last much longer. They're a little more expensive, but they're well worth it. So I guess this morning the take-home message is use multiple modes of action to herbicides throughout the year. Use air induction nozzles to reduce drift and crop damage. As far as I'm concerned, all herbicides should be sprayed with air induction nozzles. We should not be using the flat fan nozzles. The spray solution coming out of a flat fan nozzle is too driftable, and we have many sensitive crops in the areas that we're spraying. We're also very close to the urban centers, and so if we can show that we are doing a proper job of keeping that pesticide where it should go, then we are much more in tune with what the urban people are hoping for our operations. And calibrate to confirm the delivery rate. Make sure that you're putting on what you've calculated to be. So with that, I'm just going to leave that one formula. That last one, nozzle spacing, should be in centimeters, not meters. That's so it needs to be centimeters, but that is the only formula that you should need. And with that, I'll turn it back to Molly, and I'll just leave that up there for a while if people want to write it down, and Dwayne, and if there's any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken. That was a really great presentation. You certainly covered a lot of material, and we definitely appreciate the time spent on the different herbicide products, because it is true we've used a fairly limited slate of products in the past. Are there any questions from the group? If you'd like to use the chat box, or we can, you can unmute, or I can unmute you for a moment. Perhaps try the chat box first. I'll just give a minute. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come in at this stage. So thank you, Ken. Appreciate you joining us. Dwayne and I just got a couple quick updates that I think we will do to close out the meeting. So when, there we go. Okay. I think we can go off of your screen share there, Ken.
Yes, I was trying to get back to that. Oh, there it is.
Awesome.
Stop share.
Perfect. Great. So Dwayne, should I turn it over to you for a couple updates, horticultural updates before we finish?
Be fine, Molly.
Great.
Did that screen come up? Is there a screen with degree day accumulations up? No.
Yeah, that looks good. We're seeing not the slideshow version yet, though.
There we go.
Perfect. Looks good.
All right.
Thank you.
Just have a couple of slides to put up this morning. Just wanted to talk briefly about the degree day accumulations to date, and the environmental conditions that we're experiencing and that are in the forecast, and how that influences crop development, pest development, and some of our management decisions that are coming up. Just backing up, full bloom this year was pretty close to an average year. It was around May 1st in cherries, give or take a couple days depending on your location. But since that time, it's been relatively cool compared to other years. And our degree day accumulation as of 2 days ago was only about 80 degree days, base 10, which doesn't mean a lot unless you compare it to other years. And last year we were at 130 degree days at this point, and we're accumulating maybe 5 or 6 degree days a day, or maybe not even that in cooler weather. And in 2018, we were at 180 degree days at this point, and it was back in 2017 that we were almost identical to where we are now. So what that means really is that the heat accumulation since bloom has been relatively slow, and that's probably slowed down crop development and insect development as well for certain pests that correspond to heat accumulation through the heat season, like cherry fruit fly. There's a good degree day model that helps us time when that spray is going to be needed. So that can change fairly quickly though, and be aware that you know, a few days of hot weather can catch us up in time fairly quickly. So things can slow down or move ahead very rapidly at this time of year. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be that much later in another 2 or 3 weeks time. In regard to what the conditions have been and the forecast, I know we've gone through some fairly cool and rainy weather. Certain pests like that, we seem to see more black cherry aphid oftentimes when conditions are cool, and I don't know if people found black cherry aphid, if we talked about it last week and you went out and took a look, or if any action has had to be taken. But in the coming days, we've got a forecast for fairly warm temperatures, possibly in the high 20s by the end of the week. And under those type of conditions, especially following relatively wet weather, we'll probably have high humidity, and it'll be ideal for powdery mildew to grow. So, you know, when we get cool weather and a sudden surge in temperature, we get rapid shoot growth, new unprotected tissue, and a susceptible host to powdery mildew. So it would be important to stay protected for that disease, as we know, through this spring period, and especially under these conditions, you want to keep new growth protected. The other point I was going to make just quickly is on crop development. Whoops, back one. So, you know, GA timing is influenced by the development of the fruit, and usually at around 4 weeks after full bloom, or maybe even sooner in a warm year, we'd want to begin cutting cherries open to see for cherry pit hardening. And at this stage, or maybe a little bit later on, even, we would see this jelly-like substance in the center of the fruit. And what you want to watch for is just the early signs of the pit beginning to harden. And that usually coincides with the timing of our first GA application or AGA application. So it would be good for growers to start looking for pit hardening at this time, and monitor periodically, because once the temperatures warm up, the stages change fairly quickly. So, you know, if you don't look for a week, you might miss a critical time. And I think it would be wise to monitor, you know, as we get close to this timing, every 2 or 3 days. And, you know, people have used different guidelines as to when to apply the GA. At one time we relied more on the color change of the fruit, but we tend to rely more on the pit hardening stage, and when this is initiated has often been the timing that we've applied sprays. And maybe we can talk more about that next week, because we'll probably be getting closer to that. Anyway, that's all, Molly. I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Dwayne. I think that's great. So we, you know, some of us did cut some cherries out in the field last week, and, you know, just looking at, we were not yet at any kind of embryo development, but certainly I think your point to check right now, Dwayne, with the changing weather is really important. So I'm also just going to put up a couple slides very quickly to finish up the meeting. I wanted to talk a little bit about Parka sprays, because there's been a number of questions. Can you see that Parka slide there? Perfect, great. So a number of questions had come up just around the timing of Parka, and some of you are starting your applications, and this is a slide from the Parka's marketing material, but essentially Parka is adding sort of a lipid layer to the cherries in order to help the suppression of cracking. Microcrack development is what they tend to talk about in the cuticle on the fruit itself. And there's been a few changes to the label of Parka recently. Previously, we talked about putting on the first application when, again, color change was happening, or there was even actually some information that I want to point this out, Ken, while you're on the line, because the production guide information is actually really out of date. So please don't refer to the production guide information online, and do check the new label from Cultiva, because the new application timing is listed as husk fall. And this is an image I took on Friday while over in Creston. And so a number of our varieties really truly are at the husk fall stage. And so applications of Parka can be starting now, with the second application going on at the straw yellow timing. So the application rate is 1 gallon per acre rate. I put 3.78 liters. And the water volume that is recommended, previously on the old label, it was 100 to 200 US gallons of water per acre, with a caution to not exceed 200 gallons per acre. So just wanted to point that out. The new label doesn't give this caution, but in the past it was on the label. And I know many of you are using 100 gallon per acre water volume for this spray. And a couple other cautions were added to the new label, which shows generally some mixing instructions. And I do think this is important, especially when we're talking about putting on mildew sprays where we might be using sulfur products. Parka is not to be applied within 3 days of sulfur. And there is a do not mix or overlap with Captan within a 10-day period, as well as not within 7 days of lime sulfur applications. Several other do not tank mix recommendations are made by Cultiva. One is to not mix with EC products, not that we have a whole lot of ECs that we're putting on cherries generally, but just be aware of that. The other is to avoid products containing oil. So this would not be a time to mix Parka, say, with the Pure Spray Green for mildew suppression. And it also recommends not to use surfactant stickers or the pinylene-based products, which is VaporGuard. So you would not mix Parka with VaporGuard. That is not something that we would recommend, and it's certainly not supported by the manufacturer of the product. And the other caution is when you are mixing with GA, which is a common application that many of you are doing, the recommendation is to apply the product at 72 hours prior to rainfall for the best results. So in any case, just wanted to point out a number of the cautions there. The timing looks to be good on many of your blocks for the various varieties for husk fall, so we can go ahead with Parka. However, just also be aware of the pH in the tank. 5 to 7 is recommended, and when you're doing your mixes, to add the Parka last to your tank as well. So just another thing that was kind of interesting, a colleague in Washington State sent this image on Friday as well, and this is something that was happening in their orchards. And it was my observation as we walked around and looked at various blocks that there are a number of late bloom or other small cherry fruitlets that are forming. And so I wonder, in looking at this image, if we may not also be seeing a heavy drop coming for June drop. And I certainly see in Kelowna this week where things are changing, and we're probably a week to 10 days ahead of where much of Creston is, that it looks as though, even though we have a very poor crop set, we might also have quite a heavy drop. So just something to keep an eye on, and perhaps when we talk to GA, we can talk a little bit more about updates as to where we're at with the drop as well, and whether or not botrytis sprays or other things might be appropriate. So I had included just a couple other images. We talked a little bit about cherry fruit worm last week, and Dwayne provided some really good historical trapping data from previous years that had looked at 12 orchards in Creston and really didn't find any fruit worm. Although a different lure was being used than what we're using right now, the overall, at the time, the population appeared to be quite low. However, many of you did come with traps that you were looking at, whether you'd identified, codling moth or the fruit worm on them. And I think it's safe to say, Dwayne, that we don't have codling moth so far on those traps, that they're not identified as codling moth. However, there does still appear to be some mystery moth being caught on many of the traps. We'll have to try to look at that again. But I did ask Sarah for a couple more photos, and she sent this one, which I thought was kind of interesting, just showing relative size of cherry fruit worm moths. This is out of an orchard where she's confirmed a presence and is doing a little bit of trapping research this year down in the South Okanagan. So that gives you a little bit better image. And this image unfortunately came in quite grainy, but showing 2 of them on the very small squares. So, you know, on these green squares, you can kind of get a relative size of what those cherry fruitworm moths will look like. And as we talked about before, it's really the larva that we're able to control. We don't have a pesticide that is going to control the moth itself. So even if we start to catch moths, we're not looking at a knockdown for adult populations. We used the OBLR sprays that went on, you know, generally last week and the week before in order to help to control this larva. And again, when we move into the summer, you know, we're going to be applying many more spinosas, delegate, Entrust, as well as XRL, which would also control any larvae that we might see later on in the season. So just a reminder that in CFI's porch samples, it was less than 1% capture on these fruitworm larvae. So I think the general pressure is quite low, but we definitely appreciate everyone pulling their traps and bringing them in just to double check and make sure that you are aware of what you're looking at on those traps. All right, great. So I will leave it there. And I think we might have just had a couple questions. I'm just gonna try to see whether there was anything that we have left unanswered. So, all right, thanks Ken and everyone. It looked like you were responding to a number of questions about where to purchase air induction nozzles, and there was a question, do air induction nozzles, are they interchangeable with flat nozzles? And
Yep.
Great, and they are.
Also, that information that you gave on Parka, it really kind of shows that you need to take and go to the label. The label just doesn't tell you the rate and whatnot. There are some do nots on the label, and there was a whole list of them there with the Parka that growers really need to pay attention to. And
That's true. Thanks, Ken. Yeah, great. Okay, we have okay, so Greg, the recommendation by CFI is to spray immediately if we find one on the trap. Is that not the case with fruitworm? Yeah, definitely not the case, because we don't have an adulticide that would control the adult moths of fruitworm. In fact, we really don't have adulticides, you know, for OBLR or even for codling moths. So I think it's really important to understand the life cycle of this particular pest, which we are trying to focus on targeting the larva for control. Those, we have a number of larvicides that we can use. We're recording, so I won't give you my personal opinion on where I feel this trapping program is going, but perhaps that's a discussion that we can take up with the BC Cherry Association for future. So I think, you know, please do not go out and try to spray for adult moths is the message that I'd like to make. I don't know, Dwayne, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that's important to recognize, Molly. And I was just thinking that there's maybe a bit of uncertainty about identifying the moths, and particularly for cherry growers who aren't familiar with codling moths. What I could do is take a trap bottom down to grower supply, if that's okay with Grant, and we could maybe hang it up down there or set it out where it's convenient for people to look at so that they can identify codling moths. And whether we capture cherry fruitworm here in the valley, will or maybe a sample could be sent over from the Okanagan or brought over to show what the moths look like, because it's easier in person to see them than it is on a picture. But anyway, when we did look for cherry fruitworm back in 2006, 7, and 8 over the 3-year period, we didn't catch any cherry fruitworm moths here. I mentioned last week that I thought we had, but I looked back at the data and we didn't. But that's not to say that they aren't here. They may have come in since, or there's a different lure possibly that may be more attractive to them. So, but I would think the population pressure is likely fairly low with the number of insecticides that we put on for cherry fruit fly and SWD. So we certainly have to be on guard for them, but we'd like to ensure that we're identifying the 2 moths properly. So I will take that one trap bottom down to grower supply, if that's all right with Grant.
And I'll try to bring over a sample if I can get one from from Sarah my next trip over. Rick had another question. Is Basagran the only option for weed control on a new planting at second leaf, Ken?
No, and I'd have to go back through and look at everything. It was one of the weird things that I saw on the Basagran label, that it stated, that's what it states on label, registered on new planting. It doesn't say that it's registered on any other time. And so need to look at the label to see what type of restrictions are on any of the others. I don't know if Dwayne, if you can add anything, if you know of to that.
No, I'm not certain of anything else, Ken.
I will, I'll check through the product list, and then I'll get it to Molly and she can send it out later.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Ken. Excellent. So I think we were a little bit over time, but if there's no other questions or discussion, then we'll probably wrap up for today. Great. So thank you very much, Ken, for joining us. I think that was great information, and we hope to perhaps convince you to come back for air blast sprayer calibration info later in the season. So
yep,
excellent.
No problem.
Great. Thanks, Dwayne. And I'll send out the recording and follow-up information, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week. We'll leave it there. Thanks. All right. Goodbye, all.